All right, guys, welcome back to our last video to go along with part 4. We are on page 214 now, which is going to deal with the multiple choice questions and the writing prompts down at the bottom of the page. So, we have already finished annotating our historical account and our historical fiction story. So, now we're ready to move on and answer these multiple choice questions. So, up at the top of the page, I have rewritten the title of lesson 19, which is comparing and contrasting genres. I have written that out. I'm not going to go over it again because I've already gone over it twice. So, hopefully, by now you know it. So let's go ahead and look at our directions for the multiple choice questions. So it says to use the hints on this page to help you answer the questions. All right, so we know we've got hints and we know that the hints correspond with each question. So let's go ahead and look at the hint for number 1. And I'll let you work through number 1 and then we'll talk about the answer. So the hint for number 1 says compare paragraph 4 of the historical account with the girl's experience in the train to somewhere. What similarities and differences do you find? All right. So, for this question, I know I'm going to have to go back and look at paragraph 4 of the historical account. I know the title of the historical account was Orphan Train Riders. It's on page 212. So you're going to have to go back and look at paragraph 4. And as you're looking at paragraph 4, you're going to compare it to the girl's experience in the historical fiction text, The Train to Somewhere. You're going to see what similarities there are and what differences there are. So you're going to think about that. So let's look at number 1 and see what the question is. So it says, which detail from the historical account best supports the fictional story about a girl's orphan train experience? So I know my historical account is nonfiction. And I know I'm looking for a detail in that historical account that's going to support the fictional story about the girl that we just read about in the last video. So, in order to be able to answer this question, you're going to have to go back and look at paragraph 4 of the historical account and think about what similarities and what differences there are in both texts. So we're looking for the answer choice that's correct is going to be a detail from the historical account that supports the story about the girl's orphan train experience. So guys, I want you to go ahead and answer this question on your own because this is a part 4. This is to see what you know. So I want you to answer number 1, and when you come back, we will go over the correct answer. All right, so go ahead and do that for me now. Answer number 1. All right, guys, so I'm assuming you're back because you have answered number 1 and you're ready to go over the correct answer. So let's start by looking at answer choice A. Answer choice A says handbills advertise the arrival of the orphan train in town. Well, if I think back to my historical account, the nonfiction text that we did in the first video, there was absolutely no mention of handbills that were advertising the orphan trains coming to town. That this is not accurate. The passage never mentions it. So because of that, I can eliminate answer choice A. So let's look at B. The children were all adopted into caring families in new homes. Well, if you think back to this detail in the historical account, we know based on what that passage told us, not all children went to homes that loved and cared for them. That passage said that some kids were abused and some kids ran away because they didn't like their new family. So they didn't all get to go to caring homes. So we know that this is inaccurate. So this makes this answer choice incorrect. So I'm going to eliminate answer choice B. So that leaves C. Crowds gathered at the town stations to greet the orphans. Well, if I'm thinking about answer choice C, I know that this doesn't really totally reflect on the girl's experience on the orphan train that we read about in The Train to Somewhere. But this could be a potential answer, maybe. I need to look at answer choice D and see which one is best. So D says the experience was quite upsetting for the orphan children. So I know, based on the historical account passage that we did in the first video, I know, well, I can infer at least that the experience was pretty upsetting, right? These children were orphans and they were being shuttled from the city that they knew to a whole new area. They were being displayed on stage and people were adopting them. They didn't always go to happy homes. So that could be quite upsetting. And if I'm thinking about the passage, The Train to Somewhere, the story, the fictional story about the girl, I know at the beginning she was very worried, right? She was very concerned. She didn't know what her future would look like. She was worried her brother would be separated from her. It was all very uncertain and unclear. And I know the tone of that was also pretty negative, right? So it could be upsetting. So I know that kind of goes along with our tone, which is negative. So between answer choice C and D, I would say D is definitely our better option here because it corresponds with both passages. It goes along with the historical account and the historical fiction story. So D is our correct answer. So let's go ahead and look at number 2. Let's look at the hint that goes with it first. So the hint says, reread the chart on the first page of this lesson. How does the author of the historical fiction piece alter history? All right, so if you go back to the chart that we looked at in part 1, we know that in historical fiction pieces, authors sometimes choose to alter historical details to make the story more interesting or more entertaining for the readers. Yes, they do keep some details the same, but sometimes they change some stuff up by throwing in those story elements. So we're going to have to think about that to answer number 2. And number 2 says, which statement best describes how the author of The Train to Somewhere alters historical details to tell her story? So we know The Train to Somewhere is our fictional text. It's the historical fiction story about the girl. So we have to figure out how the author altered historical details in order to tell her story. So if you look back where we annotated the passage, we talked about all those story elements. All those story elements are kind of add-ins that change some stuff up. So I want you to go back and look at The Train to Somewhere, and I want you to think about how the author alters their details. And I want you guys to go ahead and answer this question. When you're finished, you'll come back and we'll go over it together. All right, guys, good luck. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and go over number 2 now that you've answered it. So, once again, we were trying to figure out how the author of The Train to Somewhere alters historical details to tell her story. So, let's look at answer choice A. It says the author includes historical facts, such as when the Children's Aid Society was formed. So, if you go back and look at the passage, The Train to Somewhere, you know the author does include historical facts. And yes, they do mention the Children's Aid Society, but they don't let us know when it was formed. It never mentions that specific date. So we can eliminate answer choice A because that's not mentioned in the historical fiction passage. So now let's look at B. The author describes the experiences and feelings of an imaginary orphan who was sent west on an orphan train. Well, we know that in this answer choice, it's probably talking about the girl, right? Who's our main character, the one who's telling the story. And we know the author does describe her experiences and feelings. And we know she was an orphan who was sent west on an orphan train. So, right now, everything answer choice B is giving us is accurate. All of this is how she alters history in The Train to Somewhere because we know that she adds in that character, right? And she tells us how she feels and about her experience. So this is a potentially good answer choice, but we need to look at C and D before we can decide for sure. So C says the author provides specific details about families who agreed with Brace's beliefs about the ways to help needy orphan children. Well, we know the historical fiction passage, The Train to Somewhere, never actually gives us specific details about the family's beliefs who adopted these kids. We know that sometimes they went to good homes, sometimes they didn't. And this detail is never mentioned in The Train to Somewhere, so we can eliminate C. So let's look at D. The author explores the adventures of two young children as they start their new lives on a farm in rural America. Well, we know that yes, they're being taken to rural America, but this is more than just the adventure of two young kids, right? This is an orphan train experience. It's one girl's experience on the orphan train. And yeah, she is with her brother, but it's more than just their adventure of going to live on a farm. It's more so about the orphan train and how she experienced it personally. So, even though answer choice D kind of has some aspects that the fictional story does, between B and D, B is your better option here. So B is our correct answer. All right, so now let's move on to the last question that we have, which is our writing prompt. Okay, so the hint for our writing prompt is going to help us out here because it's going to let us know what we need to think about in order to respond to this passage. So, the hint says look back at the facts that you underlined in the fiction story that indicate which information both texts have in common. So we're going to go back and look at the fictional story to see what it had in common with the historical account. So for this, we are thinking about those similarities. So once again, we're thinking about their similarities and what they have in common. So you've got to ask yourself, what do these two passages have in common? So I know if I'm thinking about the similarities between a historical account and a historical fiction story, I know for the most part what they're going to have in common are those historical details. So those important historical people, the dates, the events, the facts, all of those things are details that they will have in common. So you're going to have to go back and look at the fiction story and see what we underlined that it has in common with the historical account. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and dissect our writing prompt. So, it says, compare and contrast details in the historical account of the orphan train movement to those in the fictional story. Describe how the author of The Train to Somewhere has used and altered historical facts. You have to use at least two details from the text to support your response. So, let's kind of break this down a little bit. We know we are comparing and contrasting details. So you're telling me what's similar, what's different. And you're thinking about the historical account of the orphan train movement to the details that are in the fictional story. And you've got to describe to me how the author in The Train to Somewhere, which is your fictional story, used and altered historical facts. So, guys, this writing prompt is going to be very similar to the writing prompt we did in part 3. You were just elaborating on that just a little bit more. So, you're going to tell me what historical details did the author of The Train to Somewhere use and alter in her writing of that fictional story? So you're comparing and contrasting the details from the historical account to the fictional story. And you have to have at least two specific details from the text while you are doing this. And don't forget, guys, while we are writing, I want you to make sure that you use your racist strategy when writing. So you've got to restate the prompt. You've got to tell me the title of the text, both texts. You've got to tell me the authors, right? That's important. And you've got to restate your prompt. So, after you've done that, you've got to answer the question. So, you've got to tell me how they used and altered those historical facts. C, cite your evidence. So, that would be where you're finding your two details from the text. And remember, if we're taking evidence straight from the text, it has to have those quotation marks around it. After you've cited your evidence, you have to explain your evidence. You've got to tell me why you chose to use it, what makes it important. And then at the end, guys, you've got to include a little bit of summary. Just kind of wrap it all up nicely, put a little bow on it, and have a concluding statement. All right. So I'm not going to write my answer out here for you because I don't want you guys to just straight up copy it. This I want you to do totally on your own. All right. So think about what all we've talked about and tell me how the author of The Train to Somewhere used and altered the historical facts that you can find in the historical account of the orphan train movement. And don't forget, you've got to have at least two details. All right, guys, when you have finished that, you will be good to go with part 4. If you have any questions about what we've talked about today, make sure that you let me know because I'm here to help. All right, guys, good luck with your writing prompt, and I will see you next time.